I'm Robin Lachmann. I run the Inherited Metabolic Disease Clinic at the National Hospital for Neurology in London, which is part of University College Hospitals. And they're not with me, but in another room somewhere in London are Heidi Chan and Charlotte Ellerton, are two of our specialist metabolic dietitians. I don't think any of us have ever done this before, so we thought we'd start by going over our approach to trimethylaminiuria, diagnosing and managing it, which is pretty simplistic, but it sort of explains why we do what we do. And then I'll hand over to Heidi and Charlotte, who some of you may know had a survey monkey out over the last few months, going over people's experiences with some of the diet and things, and they're going to go over some results from that. And then we'll try and answer any questions anybody might have at that point. Okay, so trimethylaminiuria is, in its classical form, an inherited metabolic disease and a very ancient disease. There's a princess in the Mahabharata, which is a Hindu epic, who was very beautiful, but smelt of fish. And Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest was also said to have a horrible smell of fish about him, and these probably represent early recognition of the disease, although it wasn't properly molecularly and biochemically characterized until much more recently. We can have the next slide. Next slide. There we go. Okay, so the problem in trimethylaminiuria is in the liver with an enzyme called flavonogenase type 3 or FMO3. I don't know if you can see my pointer, probably not, but FMO3 on the picture there. One of whose jobs is to take this molecule called trimethylamine, or TMA, and to oxidize it, to add an oxygen to it to make trimethylamine oxide, or TMAO. From our point of view, the main difference between these two substances is, whilst trimethylamine, which is chemically very similar to ammonia, and also has a very strong odor, has a smell, trimethylamine oxide is entirely odorless. So normally all of this highly smelly compound, trimethylamine, is efficiently turned into trimethylamine oxide, and there isn't a problem. But if we can have the next animation. In trimethylaminiuria, for whatever reason, this step isn't working properly. And when that happens, you get a buildup of trimethylamine, next slide, and similarly a deficiency of trimethylamine oxide. And the buildup of trimethylamine is what leads to the odor problems. Now, in classical primary trimethylaminiuria, or what I call primary trimethylaminiuria, which is a genetic disease, the deficiency in the in TMA being oxidized trimethylamine oxide is caused by a genetic deficiency in the enzyme FMO3. And therefore, this is what we call an autosomal recessive disease, and you will have inherited a faulty gene for FMO3 from each of your parents, giving you an enzyme that simply doesn't work properly and can't do the job. And that disease, primary trimethylaminiuria, normally presents very early on in life. Mum normally notices a foul smell in the nappies, and it normally presents to pediatricians. Now, I'm not a pediatrician. We work in an adult clinic. The patients we see are nearly always referred to as adults, and often haven't had problems until round about the age of puberty or later. And in that case, it really isn't a genetic deficiency of this enzyme that leads to the problem. And indeed, if we genotype and actually look at the genes for the enzyme, in most cases, they're entirely normal. So there must be other factors as well that can act on this FMO3 enzyme and stop it from working properly. And we know that one of those factors, at least in women, must be hormones, because if you take a group of women who don't complain of any symptoms at all, and you take a urine specimen every day for a month, and you measure the levels of trimethylamine and the levels of trimethylamine oxide, and then you'll see the levels of trimethylamine going up often just before and around the time of a period. So obviously hormones can have an effect on the enzyme, and we know that women with trimethylaminiuria often have symptoms that are worse around the time of their periods. But it can't just be those hormones, because men get the condition as well, and other people have symptoms at other times of the month. So there must be other factors too. And perhaps sometimes the problem is that there's just too much trimethylamine coming into the system for the enzyme to cope with. And we'll deal with that later. But for whatever reason, if trimethylamine builds up, next slide, it gets into the system, and then, like ammonia, it's what we call a very volatile molecule, as with a bottle of smelling salts, which is what's got ammonia in it. If you lift the stopper, the smells immediately escapes and goes everywhere. It's the same with trimethylamine. Once it gets into the body, it's immediately secreted in next 3 clicks: sweat, next saliva, urine, all bodily fluids. and leads to the odor that's associated with this condition. And we actually collect urine in order to make the diagnosis, because urine is much easier to collect than any of the other bodily fluids, and also the urine in your bladder represents several hours worth of the trimethylamine being excreted by your kidneys. And so the diagnosis results in rests on measuring trimethylamine and trimethylamine oxide levels in a urine specimen and showing an abnormally high level of trimethylamine and a relatively low level of trimethylamine oxide. And it's the ratio between these two, the trimethylamine to the trimethylamine oxide ratio, that tells you how well that FMO3 enzyme is working. When we make the diagnosis, as we'll come on to in a minute, we tend to ask people to load up with certain foods, particularly high choline foods, that make it much more likely that we're going to detect a high TMA level, because as you'll know from people's symptoms, they tend to come and go, and therefore the levels of trimethylamine in the body are up and down. So we need to try and make sure that when we actually do a test, we've got the best chance of getting a positive result. Next slide. So this is just showing the genetics of primary trimethylaminuria. So this behaves, as I said, as what we call an autosomal recessive disease. So if each of us has 2 copies of each gene, and in this diagram, if you think of the green FMO3 gene as being a gene that works properly and the red FMO3 gene as being a gene that doesn't work properly, then the parents at the top here, the big people, both are what we call carriers. They have one FMO3 gene that works properly and one FMO3 gene that's defective. But actually, because you have 2 copies, the one that works properly is quite capable of doing the job, and these people won't have symptoms at all. When they have children, however, those children get one gene, one copy of each gene from their parents. And so if you look at the bottom, you'll have a quarter of the children who'll get 2 green genes, because they get the green gene, the functional gene from dad and the functional gene from mum, and they will be what we call entirely normal. 2 out of 4 of the children will be like their parents. They'll have one green FMO3 allele and one red FMO3 allele. So they won't have trimethylaminuria or any symptoms, but they'll be carriers and could potentially in the future, if they happen to have children with someone else who is a carrier, pass it on. And there'll be 1/4 of the children who will have inherited the 2 red alleles and will have this autosomal recessive disorder, and will have no functional FMO3 and will have primary trimethylaminuria. But as I say, this is actually a very rare disease. We'll come into a minute, but we have, of our 200 or so patients we see with trimethylaminuria, we only know of 3 who have primary trimethylaminuria. And certainly in adults, the vast majority of patients don't actually have a genetic deficit in the enzyme at all. Next slide, please. However, it doesn't really matter whether you have the genetic form of the disease or the acquired form of the disease, some other reason for having low FMO3 activity, the management's the same. What we need to try and do in order to not cure the disease, but treat the disease and control the symptoms, is reduce the amount of trimethylamine in the body. Now, next slide. The body itself doesn't make trimethylamine at all in any measurable quantity. All the trimethylamine that's coming into the body is really coming in from the gut. The first place that all the blood from the gut goes, it gets collected up and then sent to the liver, because the liver is really our main metabolic organ. It's responsible not just for detoxifying things, but also for extracting nutrients and most of the other important metabolic processes that go on. So all this trimethylamine is normally efficiently delivered to the liver, where it's effectively turned into trimethylamine oxide, and there isn't a problem. In trimethylaminuria, at least some of it will get through the liver into the circulation, into the rest of the body, and that's what leads to symptoms. So if we want to treat those symptoms, we need to try and reduce that amount of trimethylamine coming into the body from the gut. Next slide. Next. Now there is some trimethylamine present in the diet itself. It's present in things like fish and shellfish, and if it was simply a matter of cutting those out of your diet, that would be relatively straightforward, but unfortunately it isn't that easy. And unfortunately there are other sources of trimethylamine, and in fact most of the trimethylamine coming into the body from the gut isn't coming in through the diet at all. It's actually being made in the gut itself. And the picture on the right here shows the gut, and as you'll know, the gut is full of billions and billions of different bacteria, which are these different colored symbols, the circles and the ovals here. And we have billions of thousands of different species of bacteria, and they're a very important part of our digestive system. We wouldn't be able to digest our food without them. But it just so happens that some of these normal colonic bacteria, and if you, next slide please, we've chosen, next, we've just chosen green circles here, but these are normal bacteria in the gut. As part of their metabolism, next slide, they take another chemical that's present in the gut called choline, sorry, another chemical that's present in the diet and present in many different foods called choline. And they're interested, they use that as part of their metabolism. The bit they're interested in is the side chain, which is, well, unfortunately, I don't think you can see my pointer, but the side chain is the bit that's off to the right. And they want to use that in their metabolism, so they chop it off. And that leaves them at the bottom here with this molecule, which is trimethylamine. And as far as they're concerned, that is a waste product, and they just secrete it back into the gut where it's taken up into the body. And for those of you who remember your chemistry, if you look at the trimethylamine molecule, if these CH3, these methyl groups at the three corners were just H groups, hydrogen groups, it would be ammonia. Chemically, it is very similar. So it's actually choline in the diet being acted on by these gut bacteria that's probably normally the largest source of trimethylamine entering the body. And therefore, next slide, if we're thinking of dietary treatment for this condition, we don't just need a diet that's low in trimethylamine, low in fish and shellfish. Next slide. It also has to be low in choline, and that then becomes much, much more restrictive. Now, you can't actually cut choline out of your diet altogether. It really wouldn't be possible. It has been done in the research setting. People have been fed over limited periods of time synthetic diets that are lacking in choline, and that certainly isn't particularly good for you. But eating a normal diet, you won't be able to cut choline out of your diet, but you can cut down on foods that are high on choline and try and limit the amount of choline in the diet. And there are certain things like egg yolks, offal, red meats that are particularly high in choline, and we give our patients a diet sheet that lists these foods, and also some other foods, things like brassicas here, the broccoli, which, although they're not particularly high in choline, contain other chemicals that might potentially inhibit the FMO3 enzyme and therefore should be avoided as well. Next slide. So the diet sheets we use are all based on the USDA analysis of choline in certain foods, which is the only analysis we have. And we split the foods up into red foods, which really contain large amounts of choline you should try and avoid altogether. At the other end of the spectrum, there are some green foods which have relatively small amounts of choline and can probably be eaten pretty freely. And a lot of foods in the middle, which are amber, where you really need to go cautiously. They contain moderate amounts of choline, and it's a matter of finding what works for you. And although we have some diet plans that go with this to give people a start, actually different people, unsurprisingly, follow different diets, find different things work for them. And one of the reasons for the questionnaire that Heidi and Charlotte will be going over later was to have a look at that and see whether we could find some things that were common themes amongst other people's experience, and we'll go into that. So diet is probably the first step of treatment we use, and often actually because, at least in the UK, when we send a urine specimen off, a choline-loaded urine specimen, that's we get people deliberately to eat the red foods for a day or so before they do the urine specimen to give us the best chance of detecting a high trimethylamine level. They come to clinic with that urine, we send it off to the lab in Sheffield. We know it's going to take 5 or 6 weeks to come back with the result. In the meantime, people are always keen to try something. So the first thing we suggest people try is the diet to see how they get on with that. Once we have the result back, we can then think about other forms of treatment. Next slide. And the next thing you can think about doing is actually addressing this issue of the bacteria in the gut that are converting choline into trimethylamine. So you can think of the gut like being a glass, a container that's full of bacteria, and it holds a certain amount of a mixture of different bacteria. And some of the bacteria, these green circles, are producing trimethylamine from choline. Now, if we knew exactly which bacteria they were, and we had tools that were specific enough to go in and specifically take those away and leave everything else behind, that would be the ideal treatment. But unfortunately, we're not in that position for 2 reasons. Firstly, actually, we don't know exactly which bacteria are producing trimethylamine. We know roughly which group of bacteria they are. They're a group called the anaerobes, but we don't know exactly which ones, and that's a big group of bacteria. And secondly, even if we did know which they were, we simply don't have tools that are specific enough to go in and take out 1 species of bacteria, 2 species of bacteria, and leave all the rest behind. The antibiotics, we do have a much more, what we call broad spectrum than that. They kill a wider range of bacteria. So what we can use is a group of antibiotics that are particularly active against these anaerobic bacteria. Next slide. And we can give a course of antibiotics for a couple of weeks, which is longer than most courses you would use to treat an ordinary infection, but we want to have as much effect as we can on the gut. And after 2 weeks of those antibiotics, there'd basically be fewer bacteria in the gut. So the glass would be no longer full, there'd be fewer bacteria altogether, there are fewer green circles, and therefore there's less trimethylamine being produced at this point. Now, unfortunately, we can't keep people on antibiotics forever. Many antibiotics wouldn't be good for you in the long run, and in any case, the bacteria, if they're exposed to the antibiotics chronically, will get resistant to them. And so after a course of antibiotics, we have to stop. And then over time, unfortunately, bacteria will do what they do. Next slide, which is that they will gradually, or even quite quickly, multiply, and you'll be back where you started. The glass will be full again, pretty much the same mix of bacteria you had before, and you'll be producing larger amounts of choline again. So it's at this point up in the top right-hand corner, next slide, where we can intervene again to try and change the balance of bacteria in the gut away from those that produce trimethylamine, hopefully to bacteria that don't. And this is where the role of probiotics comes in. Probiotic bacteria, the sort of bacteria you find in probiotic preparations, are things like bifidobacteria, acidophilus, lactobacilli, and we know that they don't produce trimethylamine. So over at this point here, after the antibiotics, when we've made a gap in the gut flora, we actually get people to take probiotics. Then those probiotics will quickly fill up that space that we've made. And once the glass is full again, there isn't room for the other bacteria to divide anything like so quickly. And with luck, we may actually be able to get a long-lasting alteration in the gut flora so that there are fewer of the trimethylamine-producing bacteria. And if at the same time you're following a diet that's low in choline as well, and you're feeding them less choline, these two approaches, the diet and the antibiotics, are actually synergistic. They'll work together to bring down the levels of trimethylamine still further. At least we hope that we will. Now, the advantage of having the urine test is that we can measure the trimethylamine levels after a high choline load to show that people have got trimethylaminuria. But we can also use them to monitor the response to treatment. So when we see people on diet, we can again repeat trimethylamine levels and see where the levels are. And then we can add in antibiotics and see whether there's any further effect. And this is quite important because it turns out that actually a lot of people with trimethylaminuria are never aware of the odor themselves, or only under certain very specific circumstances. And this isn't at all uncommon with odors. We get used to odors very quickly. We're exposed to them every day. And so it's very important to be able to give people feedback and prove to them that we're actually bringing the levels down, and they should be more confident about what they do in their everyday life. Next slide. Now, there are some other approaches to treatment as well. There's this vitamin called riboflavin, vitamin B2, that can certainly be very useful in some patients. Like every enzyme in the body, or nearly every enzyme in the body, FMO3, flavin-oxygenase type 3, has a cofactor it needs to make it work efficiently. And many of these cofactors are vitamins. That's what vitamins do in the body. They help processes work properly. Now, if you've got a normally functioning FMO3 enzyme, then there's more than enough riboflavin in the everyday diet for it to work properly. But in trimethylaminuria, where we know that sometimes the enzymes, for whatever reason, aren't working properly, there are some patients who respond very well to be given what you can think of as a pharmacological, a drug dose of riboflavin, if you like, about 100 milligrams a day, which are the sort of tablets you can buy in health food shops. And we normally recommend everybody tries that at least for a few weeks to see if it has any effect. Even if it doesn't make your odor better, it will make your urine go bright yellow, because that's what it does. Okay, and then the next slide. And the other things that a lot of people next will have heard about are things like charcoal and copper chlorophyllin. Now, these don't actually get absorbed into the body at all. They act solely within the gut. And the idea is that they bind not just trimethylamine, but a number of small, what we call small volatile molecules within the gut, and stop them from being absorbed into the body. Charcoal is something we use in the hospital. We use in the accident emergency department, particularly when people come in having taken overdoses or poisoning, because it will bind to all sorts of small molecules, including drugs. So if you're on prescription medicine, it's very important to be careful with the charcoal and make sure that it doesn't interact with the drugs you're on, or that you take it well away from other tablets. Copper chlorophyllin is presumably acting in a similar manner. There isn't actually much scientific evidence behind either of these. Those of you in the States will know that it's sold there as nullo to hunters as a general nocturnal deodorant, they call it, with the idea being that it will bind to all sorts of small molecules that might lead to some kind of odor. Next slide. Oops. So those are sort of how we view the disease in a very simplified way, the approaches to treatment we use, to monitoring. We've now seen over the last few years, or on our books, we have almost 200 patients now. Of those, 136, so the vast majority, do actually end up having confirmed trimethylaminuria. If we load them up with choline, we can measure high levels of trimethylamine in the urine. But that can vary from, if the normal range in the laboratory we use goes up to about 11. There are plenty of patients who will have levels of 20 to 30, some will have 15 to 20, but there'll be other patients who can get their levels up 200 to 300 or so. So there's a huge variety in the amount of levels we can see after a single test, although the symptoms don't necessarily correlate with those. And as I say, of those patients, only 4, sorry, I said 3 before, but it's 4 we've shown have primary genetic trimethylaminuria. We've actually stopped routinely doing the genetics now because our hit rate was so low. There were another 3 people who were homozygous for what's called the common polymorphism. Polymorphisms are changes in the sequence of a gene that are actually very common in the population. We don't really know what they mean. But in trimethylaminuria, there is a theory that if you have 2 of these common polymorphisms, it might put you at increased risk of disease. But the vast majority of patients where we've genotyped don't actually have any abnormalities in the gene as well. Of those 199 patients we've seen as well, 51 have actually been shown after choline loading to be trimethylamine negative. The other patients missing there, we're either waiting for the results or we're not entirely convinced by the results yet, what we call equivocal. These patients who we never manage to measure high levels of trimethylamine in the urine, that doesn't mean they don't have a problem. There are probably other similar chemicals handled in the body by other processes, but unfortunately, because we can't measure them, because we haven't done the biochemical characterization, it's very difficult to either make a diagnosis or give specific advice. Although it's interesting that, as I said before, quite often when we see people in the 5 to 6 weeks before the test comes back, they do try the low choline, low trimethylamine diet. And there's a fair percentage of those people who test negative for trimethylamine who will still find the diet useful. Again, suggesting that there are probably very similar substances perhaps being handled in the gut in a similar way. And there's also a number of those patients who will find a course of antibiotics quite useful. So sometimes we're willing to try a course of antibiotics as a one-off to see whether it helps. So that's my bit done. I think probably the best thing to do now would be to hand straight over to Heidi and Charlotte to go over the questionnaire findings, and then we could take the questions, all of us together, at the end of the session. If that's all right.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks very much, Dr. Lachmann. I'm just going to pull up Heidi and Charlotte's slides now on the questionnaire that they did. Okay, great. So yeah, Heidi and Charlotte, all set for you. I'll mute my microphone again, and then we'll do questions at the end.
Hello, I'm Heidi. And I'm Charlotte. Can everyone hear us all right?
Yeah, I can hear you fine over here.
Good. So we both work with Dr. Lachmann at the National Hospital. We sit in his clinic, and we therefore have seen any patients that have come across with suspected trimethylaminuria, and then we see subsequent patients if they return for follow-up appointments as well. And we just thought we'd talk about the results of a survey that we did online. We were quite interested to sort of understand more from people who have trimethylaminuria, what they're doing with the diet, and how things are managed sort of, outside of clinic, because we might only see people every couple of months. So we just thought we'd present the results here of the survey and get some feedback from yourselves. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you.
So as Charlotte said, that the aims of the survey were to collect more information about people with TMAU, just to see how they manage with the advice that we give them when we see them initially. We also wanted to know how restrictive people were being with the diet, and we appreciate how much time and effort it takes to undertake the diet. It's quite complex as well, and we hope that the information we've collected will help to improve our practice. Next slide, please. So this was a survey which we put on the SurveyMonkey link. I'm not sure if some of you have seen this or even participated in it. We approached people we have in our clinic, and we also did provide the link to other dietitians across the UK who have also seen TMAU people as well. So we assume that the people that completed the survey are not just our patients. So the survey has 5 sections. We collected information on diagnosis and symptoms because we were interested to see how people get diagnosed, because we understand it's quite a long journey. We wanted more information on how people were managing their diet, the non-dietary aspects as well, living with TMAU, and also some demographic details just for our information. Next, please. So the data that we collected showed that 96 people started to fill in the questionnaire, but only 84 people finished it completely. But we think that's a very good response, so we were very, very happy that 84 people completed the survey. And of those, 90% of people that clicked onto the online survey had a positive diagnosis, with a small percentage who had a negative diagnosis after they had their urine sent off to the laboratory in Sheffield. Over half of these said that their diagnoses were given or confirmed by a specialist consultant. Some of them were diagnosed by their general practitioner, which is a local doctor, and 20% ticked other. So we assume that they had diagnosis confirmed through other means that did not come from a hospital consultant or a local doctor. Next.
Okay, I'm going to start speaking now because I think Heidi's voice is going. So firstly, we asked a bit about how people found out about trimethylaminuria. It's a rare condition, and even though people might have symptoms, they may not be aware that the condition has a name and there are other people with similar symptoms. So as you would probably expect, the largest proportion of people said they found out more about TMAU on the internet, and there are a number of sort of websites and forums where people can find advice and speak to other people. Television was also quite high. In the UK, in the last couple of years, Dr. Lachmann has featured on a number of television programmes, which have definitely, we think, raised awareness in the UK. And we've seen quite a positive kind of response rate from people coming through either directly to us or via their GP if they suspect they may have a thing. They may have the condition that they've seen. And then also smaller numbers find advice through articles in magazines or papers, through friends or relatives, and also for some it's been through their general practitioner, but that generally we find is not the experience of a lot of people, that GPs aren't always aware of the condition. Can we go to the next slide, please? Then we also wanted to ask how long people had symptoms for before they were diagnosed, and as you can see here, a huge proportion of people have had symptoms for more than 10 years before they actually received a diagnosis or were able to put a name to their condition, which just shows how difficult it still can be to have the condition recognised. Hopefully this is improving, and encouragingly, sort of some people did say that they sort of had symptoms for less than that time. But I think this is something that shows that a lot of people spend time with symptoms but unsure of how to manage them. And hopefully this is something that over time will continue to improve so that people get diagnosed much more quickly. Next, please. We then asked as well about how the odour was described, because we know that an alternative name for TMAU can be fish odour syndrome. But actually, interestingly, the most common description for the odour that people had referred to was fecal, with almost 50% of people were saying that was an option. Other descriptions did include fishy, but also similar to garbage. A smaller number described it as smelling similar to burnt rubber. And then other descriptions, which we included as sort of a free text option for people to type in how they would either describe it themselves or other people have described it, included musty, smelling of rotten meat, or similar to ammonia. Also, interestingly, people said that descriptions of their odour could be varied, so different people might sort of report it smelling as different things, and also that over time their odour could change. So it may be predominantly described as one odour initially, but then over time it might be described as something else. The next slide, please. We then asked as well if people were aware of their symptoms, and if you sort of include the two groups of yes, always, and sometimes together, then the majority of people do have some awareness of their symptoms at some time. What it's not always clear from this, the answer that we've given, whether that's an awareness as in directly aware of the odour or just reacting to perhaps other people around them. There is obviously a proportion of people that aren't aware of their symptoms themselves, and that can make managing the condition quite difficult because ideally you need some feedback to see if the treatments that you're trying are actually working. But it was quite interesting to see that a larger proportion of people do have some awareness of their symptoms at some point. Next slide, please.
And then, as part of that question, we also asked what makes the symptoms worse. And as you can see from the graph, the majority of people ticked that there are certain foods that make the symptoms worse. And quite a high proportion of people ticked stress or anxiety. And I guess that makes sense because in stressful situations or when you're anxious, you perhaps perspire more, and obviously the TMA comes out through your sweat. And also, as Dr. Lachmann explained previously, the hormones in the menstrual cycle can also make the symptoms worse. 3 people ticked none of the choices that we had listed make the symptoms worse, and 28 people ticked other. So next, please. So the other, some of the things we've listed here are the common themes that people put for other, and they were medications, coffee, alcohol, the seasonal change of all the weather, participating in physical activity, sweating, and also contraceptives as well. And interestingly, some people found it difficult to actually pin down the actual factor that can exacerbate the symptoms. Next, please. So then we asked a very useful question of, did making changes to the diet, did people make changes to the diet before they got and confirmed diagnosis? And as you can see, the majority of that showed that people did make changes before they got a diagnosis. And I think a lot of people do a lot of research, etc., whilst they're waiting for the results. And I guess it's because the urine results do take quite a long time to get back. Next, please. So as Dr. Lachmann explained previously, the dietary treatment is of a low choline diet, as well as reducing an intake of TMA in certain foods. And 84% of people that completed the questionnaire do restrict choline in their diet, and 16% of respondents do not restrict protein, so they eat freely as such. Next, please. So then for the people that ticked yes for restricting a diet, we were interested to see how people managed this and how often they did this, because in essence we do recommend that the diet is for symptom control, and we were surprised to learn that the majority of people, as you can see on the graph, restrict their diet or follow the diet for 7 days of the week. So that's, that's quite a lot. Next, please. And then we were interested to know, for the people that restrict choline in their diet, what type of foods they avoid. And as you can see, quite a lot of people, in terms of the percentages, avoid things that are high in TMA and also high in choline, such as the whole of an egg or an egg yolk. Also similarly, offal and beef in terms of the percentages, and then again veal and red meat. So quite a lot of meat and poultry as well, and also liver and liver products. Next, please. And then a percentage of people also ticked that they avoid milk as well, and we wanted to know what types of milk they avoid. And quite a high number of people avoid soya milk, and then sheep and goat's milk, and then after that cow's milk of the varying percentages of fat. So that was quite interesting for us as well. Next, please. So for those people that avoided milk, we were interested to see if they use an alternative, and it was interesting for us to see that quite a lot of people use rice milk, and some chose rice milk with added calcium, and also 13 people choose a coconut type milk as well, and a small number of people choose milk with oat milk with added calcium. Next, please. And then interestingly for us, 90% of respondents said that they do not eat any type of fish products, such as fish paste or fish oils, fish cakes, anything with fish in it. So even though the literature that we have read says that freshwater fish does not contain TMA, it was interesting to know that a lot of people actually avoid fish. And in the survey, 78% of people said that they avoided freshwater fish. So it may suggest that generally people just avoid all types of fish, and it could be because they're not sure if it makes their symptoms worse, or they perhaps don't like it, or they think it's safer that they avoid it in general. Next, please. And then we asked a question about cheese as well, and this was very interesting for us. We were slightly surprised by this. A lot of people with TMAU avoid all types of cheeses, as you can see there. So there's varying types of cheeses there. There's your hard cheeses, your soft cheeses, your blue cheeses. We were genuinely quite shocked to see this. But you can see the percentages there are quite high. Next, please. So other foods that people avoid included foods that contain lecithin, such as chocolate, ice cream, margarine, mayonnaise. Quite a high number of people avoided yeast extract type foods. And then in the other drop-down section, a lot of people wrote their own things that they avoided, and the ones that were commonly repeated again were things like E-numbers, additives, preservatives, sulfur, onions and garlic, cola drinks, and specific types of oils like vegetable oils and olive oil, and also fried foods. Next, please. So then we asked the question about alcohol, and about 34% of people felt that alcohol does affect their symptoms, and as you can see, quite a large amount of people do avoid alcohol, and that's their way of managing their symptoms. 32% were unsure, and for the people that did consume alcohol, more than half of them said that before they drank alcohol they would think about how much choline it had before they would consume it. So obviously people are looking more at choline content of food and of drink as well. Next please.
So then we looked at the possible overall side effects from restricting the diet, because I'm sure as anybody that has either tried the diet or is following the diet, it can be very restrictive, particularly if you follow it to the letter and try to only have the very low choline foods. I have to say that's not something we try to encourage everyone to relax the diet if possible, and not to follow it as strictly as they need to. And everyone's tolerance for choline content in their diet does seem to vary. So you can see one of the most common reported side effects, with about a third overall of the respondents saying that they had lethargy from restricting their diet, which again isn't unexpected, and could be due to a number of factors in terms of the diet. Often people find that they feel that their diet isn't very healthy once they start restricting, and that they may have perhaps a less varied diet, they choose less foods. Certainly it's quite unusual that the diet, the lowest choline options in terms of cereal products are the white products, and that's not something we're encouraged sort of too much in general healthy eating advice. Weight loss was also quite common. This is something in clinic we try to keep an eye on, and we tend to monitor this. But interestingly, some people also felt weight gain was a side effect they experienced from the diet. We tend to sort of try to encourage a balanced diet, but certainly some people have reported to us that they feel that they've cut out a lot of vegetables and things because of their concern about the choline content, and they feel this is attributable to the weight gain. Vitamin and mineral deficiency, this we asked people if they've had a vitamin or mineral deficiency confirmed by a doctor, and again quite a high proportion of people said that. We tend to, in our clinic, Dr. Lachmann will check vitamin and mineral levels before the first visit we see someone, before they actually start with the diet, just to check that baseline levels are okay, and then we sort of monitor them intermittently after that, depending on any concerns that either individual may have or we may have based on how restrictive someone's diet is. And a significant number of people did also report that they felt that they had no side effects from restricting the diet, which I suppose is a positive. So that was the summary of those answers. The next slide, please. Then we wanted to know a little bit more about, in addition to diet or separate from diet, what else other people had found is helpful to manage symptoms. Probiotics actually came out as the highest answer on that question, very closely after antibiotics. So we would normally always suggest that if you have a course of antibiotics, you follow them with probiotics. But I do know that people choose to take probiotics in between. And certainly in the general population, plenty of people take probiotics on a regular basis. So there's no reason to suggest that there would be any harm from doing that. Riboflavin was also very commonly used. Gut absorbers such as charcoal and copper chlorophyllin, people again commonly used. Laxatives came out at about 25%. It's not something we suggest in our clinic, but we have to recognise that the respondents to the survey could be from different parts of the UK, even different parts of Europe and the rest of the world. And certainly on some of the forums, I know that there's a discussion about laxatives use and how that could be of benefit. And then a small amount of people said that they didn't feel any of these actually helped their symptoms, or they didn't use any of them to manage their symptoms. Next slide, please. And then we asked about antibiotic use. So you can see from there, about a quarter of people that sort of use antibiotics every 6 to 8 weeks, which is the normal sort of gap or time period that Dr. Lachmann usually suggests to prevent over-frequent use. About the same amount of people also that they never use antibiotics. That could be for a number of reasons, but we do have patients who either don't wish to use antibiotics or feel that the diet and a combination of the other treatments mentioned before is beneficial enough. A very small section, but I think still significant section of people did say that you use antibiotics continuously, and that would be against medical advice, and it's certainly not something that we encourage in our clinic. And then people in between using them between every 3 months up to once every 12 months. So that was useful for us to know how frequently people felt they needed to use another course of antibiotics. Next slide, please. So then we asked, looking at all those treatments, which people felt were the most effective for the management of their TMAU. The one that sort of scored the highest, if you like, came out to be the diet, with antibiotics a close second, and then probiotics following that behind, which again isn't surprising because normally the two, antibiotics and probiotics, go hand in hand. A surprising number of people also felt that riboflavin was very useful for them, and certainly that's what we see. Either it works for some people or it doesn't, so it's good that it has a positive role for some people. Gut absorbers also seem to have their role, people feel they're useful, and different types of soaps. Again, we have some information on this in our diet sheet, that some people find using a lower pH soap is actually beneficial, and certainly from the answer from this survey is that people felt that was useful, or using different body products or products to wash their hair was helpful. And again, a reasonable number of people said that they didn't feel that any of these were particularly effective. Next slide, please. And then we also wanted to find out how much people were typically spending on products to manage their TMAU per month. From general discussions people have in clinic and also looking on the forums, there's many different products that are suggested. And some of these can be relatively cheap. The riboflavin isn't particularly expensive, ranging to very expensive, some products. Even the probiotics that you can use can be exceedingly expensive. And we found that over half of people are spending more than £20 per month on products just to manage their TMAU, which we thought was quite surprising and quite high. And you can see the blue section there of the pie chart is that people that are spending more than £50 per month, which is a significant amount of money on managing their condition. Next slide, please.
So then we wanted to know if people with TMAU felt that their condition affects them in carrying out their usual activities, and about 55% of them felt that it did sometimes affect them, and not surprisingly to us, but unfortunately the people that completed the questionnaire said 26% ticked yes to say that the TMAU that they have does affect them from conducting their day-to-day activities, and only a small percentage said no. Next, please. So then we kind of wanted to probe a bit further and ask how, if people experience any of the following descriptions, and quite alarmingly for us to know is that quite a high number of people do experience social anxiety, and that perhaps could be to do with being out and about, or being in confined spaces, or being in large crowds when there are lots of people. Also anxiety and depression scored quite high as well, and also people ticked paranoia, and also staying in the house as well, and only a small percentage of people ticked that they didn't experience any of this. So for us that was a little bit worrying to see that. Next slide, please. And then in response to the question before, a large percentage of people have not had any professional support, with some of the descriptions in the previous question, which is a little bit worrying for us to see, and perhaps this could be something that we think we can improve on, I think. Next slide, please. So kind of following on from all of the questions in the questionnaire, I think it's made us think about how we can improve our practice, and a lot of people put comments about how we could, you know, better support people with TMAU, and these were the comments that people came back with, and people have said that it would be useful if there were more awareness amongst health professionals, and I think sometimes it's difficult because it's so rare that people have not come across this condition before. So how can we raise awareness? And some people have suggested going into schools and workplaces to explain what the condition is, and also to improve services that people can access locally, and also people have said about putting, you know, more time and money into research into treatments and cure, and it was good to hear that a large majority of people felt that they could manage their symptoms once they had a confirmed diagnosis. Next, please. Some other people also put they would like to meet people with TMAU, and I think that's probably quite useful for some people because they feel that they can share experiences, and I think that is quite important. As you're aware, in the UK we don't have the database with all the choline content, so that would be something quite useful to the UK residents as well. And somebody did actually put to have information on portion sizes, because the USDA database gives you choline content per 100 grams of a food. And also some people would like a newsletter type with information on diet, recipes, treatment and updates, so everyone can be kept in the loop. Next, please. So from all of the results and all the data that were collected, we do have some slight concerns about how severe and how often people restrict their diet and how that affects on their overall nutritional status. We were quite shocked about the restriction of dairy products, as obviously this can increase the risk of deficiencies in calcium and vitamin D. So despite the fact that some of the cheeses are quite low in choline, we were quite shocked. People seem to avoid all types of cheese, and as people follow a restricted diet for mostly 7 days of the week, this can also pose the risk of restrictions of lots of foods for a prolonged period of time, which may lead to deficiencies such as iron and vitamin B12. We are aware that we don't have a lot of information on all the foods with their choline content, so we would like more foods to be analysed for the choline content, and we are also aware that we need to also improve the education of the advice that we give out, so that people are not avoiding foods excessively. Next slide, please. We were also concerned about how frequent people use antibiotics and laxatives, and again, it's not something we recommend for people to use antibiotics back to back without any break, as this can lead to resistance, and also we don't recommend the use of laxatives in our clinic as a way of the management. We would try to encourage people that do suffer from anxieties and other social issues that they do seek professional advice, as obviously it does impact on people's quality of life as well, and it would be useful that people can have this support in their local area. We don't know if people would perhaps like a mentor or to speak to someone else with the same condition who understands them and know what they're going through, Some people may like that. We're also aware we need to increase the awareness with local doctors, the general practitioners, and other people, healthcare professionals that people might come across in their daily lives. Next, please. So just want to say that obviously everybody is different, their symptoms differ, and how they manage their symptoms also differ. So one treatment may work for one person, but it may not be transferable to another person, or they might find that it's not effective in them, but other people find that particular treatment may be effective. So we would encourage people to speak to somebody for professional advice and to see how to best manage their symptoms. Next, please.
And then just to finish up, we wanted to say a big thank you to everybody who gave up their time to complete the survey. I'm not sure if anyone here did complete the survey, but it was very long. It must have taken quite a long time to complete. And we're thrilled to have had nearly 90 people complete it, which I think is a really big representation, hopefully, of the TMAU community. And we are hoping to publish the full results in a professional journal, if we can, and also on relevant websites to help spread awareness amongst other healthcare professionals and also the public, so that TMAU is something that they're more familiar with, which we think will be a benefit to everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Heidi and Charlotte, for those survey results. I thought that was very interesting, and you could see kind of the reaction of some people there on the chat. I'm just going to change our view here, our layout, so that maybe we can answer a few questions here. Here in the discussion notes, I've been collecting the questions that people were asking and thinking while both of the presentations were going on. So can you all see those discussion notes now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, you know, and people can keep writing, you know, questions. And of course, I know we're already very lucky to have you on a Sunday night. You may not have time to answer every single one that comes up, but however you all want to tackle some of these or address some of these issues.
We'll give it a go. There's going to be a lot of I don't knows, so that'll make it very quick. So why is it that some birth control pills eliminate the odour? I think there's no doubt that in women, odour is related to the cycle in many women. And I guess some birth control pills may suppress whatever endogenous enzymes it is that are responsible for that. However, there are certainly some people who feel that being on the pill makes it worse, not better. And we have plenty of women who are postmenopausal and are still getting symptoms. So I think I don't think we have a scientific answer to that, but if you're lucky enough to find a birth control pill that does the trick for you, then that's good. Does trimethylamine increase bacterial activity in general? For instance, in the mouth of TMA is present in saliva. Well, that's quite an interesting question, actually. Not perhaps so much trimethylamine as choline. There is certainly a plausible theory that goes that if you feed the gut bacteria with choline, the ones that need it are likely to expand. And so cutting choline out of the diet might actually have two effects. It gives them less choline to make into trimethylamine, but those bacteria might also get starved of what they regard as a vital nutrient. I don't think there's any evidence that trimethylamine itself can increase bacterial activity in general. But I'm not sure anybody's looked, in all honesty. But it's not, it's as I say, those gut bacteria, as far as they're concerned, the trimethylamine is a waste product rather than something they need, so I'd be surprised. Seeing as the low choline diet is low protein and includes a lot of refined carbs, are TMAU people more at risk of developing candida or yeast overgrowth? Not as far as I know, but I don't know if Heidi or Charlotte has any comments on that.
Okay, Sorry, I had muted Heidi and Charlotte for a moment because I think that might have been the cause of the echo. But anyway, they're back now if they can.
With regards to the Candida yeast overgrowth question, I think unfortunately the answer for that is that we don't know. I think as we sort of see from the patients that we see in clinic, how strictly people follow the diet and which foods they cut out and which foods they do include can vary. But it would be difficult to put a number on how much refined carbohydrate you eat and whether there's a threshold for the risk of developing Candida. I can't think of more people that have come through that have mentioned it, but I would say yes. Unfortunately, the answer is we're not sure, and it just adds more weight to trying to vary your diet as much as possible. We do understand that is difficult, especially as it seems that choline perhaps isn't the only thing that affects symptoms in some people, but it is about trying to try as many foods as possible and establish whether or not they do make your symptoms worse before eliminating them from your diet. I hope that's okay. Okay.
Yep, thanks for that. What's the dose of riboflavin a day? Oh, I think that 100 milligrams is going to be more than enough. But again, we don't really have much evidence for that. Some people take a couple of 100 milligrams a day. I don't think I've come across of anyone who's needed more than that. And certainly I know patients who responded very nicely to 100 milligrams a day. Does antibiotic kill the bacteria or just suppress it? Well, antibiotic, depending a little on which antibiotic you use, they will kill bacteria, but it's unlikely that they're going to kill all of them. And therefore, when you stop them, the bacteria that are left will just grow back again. So you could look at that as suppression if you wanted to, rather than killing it. I'm not sure I know what powdarco and wild oregano will be used to safely reduce bacteria in the gut. I don't know. It probably says they can on the bottle, but I very much doubt that there's any evidence for that. Beta high in betaine, is this a non-order form of choline? This is a common misconception, I think, and I think it comes down to that to the fact that the diet sheet, or rather the document we have that lists choline content in food also lists betaine content in food. They're not related to each other. They're both chemicals, but they're found in different foods, but they're not related to each other. And betaine isn't relevant to trimethylaminoria as far as I'm aware. It is relevant to some other metabolic disorders, which I think is why it was measured. Some sufferers believe that eating sweets, carbs, yogurt and/or dairy products can produce symptoms. And looking at the choline content of these foods, they're not so high in choline. I'm worried that we listen to everything that sufferer says a TMA sufferer should stay away from. We wouldn't be able to do anything at all. What's your opinion about these foods? I think it's very true that the problem we have is that it's very difficult to give hard and fast dietary advice. And we're not telling you to cut something out of your diet altogether. It's a matter of controlling things. It's not like a diabetic diet where you know exactly where the sugar is in the diet and you can tell people exactly what they have to avoid. And I think to a large extent you have to find what works for you, and certainly looking at what other people have found to work might be a useful starting point, which is to some extent why we did that survey. But at the moment, unfortunately, we don't really have any hard and fast rules. I don't know what Heidi and Charlotte think about the carbohydrate issue. Yogurt does contain choline, and dairy products do contain choline, but I'll hand over to Heidi and Charlotte for a bit more on that.
Yes, we also agree with Dr. Lachmann as well. As I said previously, what works for one person may not work for another in terms of managing their symptoms. And we do have to be a little bit careful about how restrictive you are being with your diet, as it can lead to nutritional deficiencies if people are being very restrictive over a very long period of time. Some of the yogurt foods and dairy products do contain some choline, but again, we can't really give you a specific amount as to how much you can and cannot have. That will be in relation to your symptoms. Sweets, we wouldn't really say in terms of quantity, but also generally for healthy eating, we wouldn't say eat lots and lots of sweets anyway. Carbohydrate, I think it is important that we do include some kind of starchy carbohydrate in our meals. It gives you energy, but again, it might be to do with quantities and how you cook the carbohydrate food. That may affect overall calorie intake. I don't know if Charlotte has anything to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think it's difficult because everyone experiments with different things, and certainly some people find restricting some foods works for them, like such as the cheese issue. If you look at cheese on the USDA database, it's actually very low in choline compared to other sources of protein. So it's something that we often encourage people to have as a good source of protein, as well as it containing calcium. But certainly the feedback that we've had from clinic is that people say that cheese can affect their symptoms. Not everybody. Some people seem to tolerate cheese fine, but other people do find it makes things worse. I'm just seeing Mike's comment for cheese pizza. So again, that's something that you know we're almost having to tailor on an individual basis and just ask people, are you eating cheese? And if people are avoiding cheese and milk, then we have to think about the implications of are they using another milk that contains calcium, and if not, do we need to suggest a calcium and vitamin D supplement to make sure their diet isn't deficient? I think that's about all on that one.
Okay, so moving on, could non-genetic TMAU be caused by a virus? Well, there has certainly been, it's been suggested that it's something that perhaps after a bout of hepatitis or something might be seen, because when you have hepatitis, that actually kills off liver cells, and if you would therefore kill off cells that would potentially be making FMO3, actually, after you recover from hepatitis, they grow back again. And I can't honestly say that I've met anybody where I can confidently say that a viral infection or a hepatitis beforehand led to trimethylaminuria afterwards, although I have heard that reported by others. When testing for trimethylaminuria, are saliva and other secretions ever tested to see whether TMA levels correlate with urine testing? The simple answer is no, because it would be relatively easy to collect saliva, but actually they want 10 ml of urine when we send that off to Sheffield for our tests, and collecting 10 ml of saliva is not impossible, but would take time. So I don't think it's been done on a routine basis, but I think people have detected trimethylamine in saliva before. For those people who have an odour which does not respond to a low choline diet, I think it's wise to advocate the current TMAU treatment protocol, given that such people reduce their nutritional intake to a dangerous degree. Does this apply? I think there are two issues here. There's people who we've definitely measured a high level of trimethylamine in the urine and therefore have trimethylaminuria. And in all honesty, I think I think everybody will respond to some extent to a low choline diet. It may not get rid of it altogether. So I think if people are saying the diet really isn't helping, our first response would be to have a much closer look at the diet. For people who haven't tested positive for TMA in the urine but still find the diet useful, then I don't think they're then at any more risk than the people who do have trimethylaminuria who are following the diet. So how risky is the diet as far as nutrition goes? I think that depends, obviously, to what extremes you take it. As I said before, you're not going to be able to get rid of choline from your diet altogether. You probably will end up cutting out quite a lot of protein from your diet, but most of that protein is coming from meat. Soya doesn't seem to be a good substitute, but I think there are plenty of vegetarian diets without soya in them that still have enough protein. We do keep a careful eye on people's basic nutritional status, so we'll do blood tests, making sure people aren't anemic, that their iron levels are all right, they've got B12 and folate every 6 months or every year or so. Some people, however, do choose to follow extremely restrictive diets. We've had people who basically just eat tomatoes, but that isn't because we've advised it, and actually having got them onto a rather more liberal diet, they've often had better symptom control and also obviously nutritionally better as well, often felt they've had more energy and things. But it would be nice to be able to be a lot more definite about what foods have choline in and what don't. And the problem is that, in fact, for most foods, we don't know. There is this single US database that's there. And from our point of view, actually, that has limitations in that although it has choline content for a number of raw materials, if you like, when it comes to looking at the common processed foods, they don't tend to be the foods that are available in British supermarkets or European supermarkets. So we'd certainly need a lot more information, ideally. What type of probiotics are recommended? Well, I always say cheap ones. I don't think there's any evidence that spending lots and lots of money on so-called super probiotics is going to make any difference at all. They all contain very similar amounts of bacteria, similar types of bacteria, and the bacteria are alive, so they should be able to multiply themselves. So we tend to recommend that people buy the sort of basic probiotics from their supermarket or pharmacy. The important thing being that probably the yogurt probiotics, the Yakults and things, are not strictly part of the low-choline diet, although one small pot of Yakult may not make that much difference. So we tend to suggest people go for ones that are available as powders or tablets. Could megadoses, whoops, my thing just moved, so I missed that altogether. Hold on. Could megadoses of, where are we, of probiotics after antibiotics be advisable rather than the normal dose? Is there any danger from doing that? I'm not, well, apart from a danger to your wallet, I'm not aware that probiotics have any serious side effects. But as I say, the whole point of them is that they're providing live bacteria that should multiply themselves. So I'm not sure there's much to be gained by taking enormous amounts. Although I must say we don't really know what the dose should be. And one of the things that I think we would like to do more research into is exactly which bacteria it is that are causing the problem, and therefore try and come up with a more rational way of dealing with that aspect of things. I'm curious on the percentage of TMA persons with breath versus body malodor. I think both. We see both. The number of people who come simply complaining of halitosis of bad breath, who then turn out to have positive trimethylamine, I think is probably lower than those who complain of body odor along with breath odor. Most people will have both, I think. So if it's simply bad breath, my feeling is, and I haven't actually looked back at the data specifically, but I think we probably have a lower hit rate for trimethylamine under those circumstances. Could the high number of people experience anxiety with TMAU mean there is a link between high cortisol levels and enzyme levels? Possibly, but I think it's more likely that the anxiety is secondary to the trimethylaminuria and the worrying about particularly because people don't always smell it themselves, their odor and other people's response to it. And I don't think we've looked systematically whether anxiety comes before or after the trimethylaminuria, but my guess is the anxiety is a response to the condition rather than the cause. Does cooking foods increase the choline content? I don't know. Whether Heidi or Charlotte knows, I don't know. Girls, what do you think about that one?
Again, I think this is something that we can't be sure about. I would be sceptical that cooking, particularly if it's vegetables and boiling something in water, you're actually increasing the water content. And then overall that is likely to result in a fractional reduction in the choline content of something, but whether that's significant in any way, and whether, I know someone else has suggested about cooking, making foods more sort of available for digestion and therefore may increase the choline content. I don't think there's any way of really knowing, and because we have such limited raw data on actual choline content of foods, I don't know if it would be something sort of that would be the main focus. I think cutting out the highest choline foods as a starting point would be the best approach. I don't know what you think, Heidi.
Yeah, I agree with Charlotte.
Thank you.
Okay. So moving on again. I've lost my place again. Are there any links between H. pylori and TMAU? Not that I'm aware of. Whereabouts in the body does the FMO3 enzyme act on the choline? Well, it isn't the FMO3 enzyme acting on the choline. The bacteria have their own enzymes that act on the choline, and that will happen in the gut. Small intestine or colon, well, most of these bacteria are probably colonic. Most of your bacteria are in the colon, particularly the anaerobes, but we can't be absolutely sure about that. And how soon after eating would they start metabolizing choline into trimethylamine? Again, this is the bacteria that do this. It's not one of your enzymes. Your FMO3 enzyme is then taking the trimethylamine and converting it into trimethylamine oxide in the liver to try and make it non-odorful again. I think, and again, we haven't really looked at this systematically ourselves, giving people a high choline load and then taking urine, every few hours thereafterwards. But I think from what we have seen that it's probably, if you have a high choline load, it's after 24 to 36 hours, it's mostly over and done with. By then the bacteria will have metabolized any choline to trimethylamine, and once that trimethylamine is into the body, it's extremely quick. So because it's so volatile, once trimethylamine gets into the circulation, it will immediately be secreted in the kidneys or the sweat or the saliva, so it's out of the body very quickly. It'll be quite variable, I guess, in individuals how quickly their chronic bacteria will deal with any dietary load, and that's perhaps where the idea of using laxatives comes in, that by increasing gut transit time, you may reduce the amount of trimethylamine being produced. Well, if people find it useful, that's fine, but my guess is it's not quite that simple. Can small intestinal bacterial overgrowth with an abundance of anaerobic bacteria, aerobic bacteria, and low number of anaerobic bacteria lead to odors? Well, normally when you get overgrowth, it's anaerobes that you'd expect to be growing in those. So bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine happens if there are blind loops, if you like, which can happen after surgery or sometimes anatomically. And if you can think of those sort of become stagnant, and like stagnant pools, you can get growth in them, but actually they will be starved of oxygen, so it would tend to be anaerobic bacteria. And certainly bacterial overgrowth is a possible cause of trimethylaminuria, and I can probably think of a couple of patients where we think that's been the case, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they tend to respond well to antibiotics. Is there any possible reason why taking antidiuretic medicines or eating high amounts of fiber may reduce odor? Not that I can think of, but that doesn't mean it won't work for some people. Those would sort of work against each other. Anti-diarrhea agents would tend to obviously make you more constipated, whereas fiber tends to have the opposite effect. Can milk thistle be of any benefit to TMAU people? Not that I'm aware of, and I don't even know what's in milk thistle. Heidi, Charlotte, any ideas there?
I don't think we're aware of anything. We're looking at each other sort of blankly. I know it's marketed in terms of sort of a liver detox, and a lot of people take it for general health benefits, but I haven't seen anything that would suggest that it's of particular benefit to TMAU. But then there may be no harm in trying it either.
Okay, that sounds reasonable to me. Is the diet okay without antibiotics, or do you have to do both? No, you don't have to do both. There are certainly people who find the diet is enough. They will actually act synergistically, they act together, so if you can attack both the choline coming in and the antibiotics, that's good. And there are certainly people who feel that after doing the diet, they have a single course of antibiotics or probiotics, and then that actually gives, providing they keep on the diet, lasting benefits. So presumably they've modified their gut flora to an extent where they don't need further antibiotics. And certainly I'm not keen on people needing antibiotics anymore, or having to have antibiotics any more than is absolutely necessary. And if you can get lasting benefit after a course of antibiotics and don't need any more for several months, that can only be a good thing. Soy having effects on estrogen levels in the body as well as cholesterol, blood sugar, and blood pressure. Is there an alternative food? By which you're suggesting that soy is a good thing that we should all have in our diet? I think there are lots of people who have got by for many years without any soy in the diet. I'll hand that one over to the dietitians again.
We're not aware of any other particular foods that also happen to be low choline that are also rich in isoflavones, which I think are the sort of the main beneficial properties perhaps of soy. Certainly I know certain people with TMAU do still choose to eat soy, and I think to an extent it may have to be a trade-off if you feel that a certain food is beneficial and has other health purposes, and there may be a bit of a balancing act that you can have, and certainly some other patients have, I'm aware they consume tofu and soy, whether that's because they feel it doesn't affect their symptoms too much, or whether it's because they feel it's more important to include that in their diet and accept slightly less symptom control. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. The Sheffield TMA test ratio works out about 0.8 for its reference range. With other sources, well, actually, I think the top of Dr. Manning's reference range is about 0.25, actually. So 0.8 would be very high as far as he's concerned for TMA over TMAO. I must admit, I don't, the ratio, so the ratio is supposed to tell you how efficiently the FMO3 enzyme is working. And Dr. Manning tends to take the view that if your ratio is high, then that suggests that the enzyme isn't working properly. Whereas if your TMA levels are high and the ratio is normal, that suggests that the problem is with overgrowth, if you like, with too much trimethylamine coming into the system from outside. I'm not sure how useful that is. At the end of the day, your management's going to be the same. It's a combination of diet and of antibiotics at times. And the reason I'm not convinced the ratio is necessarily all that useful is that if you look at individual people and you, over time, as you measure their levels, the ratios can change quite a lot, even when the TMA doesn't change. So we don't put too much store by the ratio, but his range is based on their experience of looking at urines from people who, their control urines, people who aren't complaining of symptoms of odor, and people with trimethylamine. And it's not at all uncommon for any tests for different laboratories to have different ratios. They're not actually measuring the enzyme activity directly. To do that, you'd have to do a liver biopsy and get liver cells, and we can't do that. Low pH soaps, the reason for using those is that, as we said, trimethylamine is similar to ammonia, and therefore it's a mild base, a mild alkali, and if you use slightly acidic soaps, they may be more efficient at getting it off the skin. That's all. Is there likely to be other similarly caused odor conditions to TMAU, and if any of these other similar conditions actually been identified? There is one other condition that's biochemically identified, something called dimethylglycinuria. And again, the Sheffield lab, if the specimens, urine specimens come back negative for trimethylamine, they will measure dimethylglycine. I have yet to see a single one come back positive. I think there are likely to be other, we know there are thousands of molecules that we can smell. I think there probably are likely to be other molecules that may indeed be handled in similar ways by the body, but unfortunately, we don't know what they are, so we can't measure them. Is use of antibiotics making bacteria more resistant? Well, that is a risk, and that's why we tend to rotate antibiotics. So although we give quite long courses of antibiotics, we wouldn't give more than 2 weeks at a time for that very reason. And we recommend rotating at least 3 different antibiotics. The idea of that being that you're not exposing the bacteria for long periods to one particular antibiotic, which could indeed, in theory at least, lead to resistance. So if you hit them with different antibiotics, one after the other, that's much less likely to happen. However, having said that, there are certainly some people who feel that one particular antibiotic is much more effective for them than some of the other ones. But there are 4 or 5 antibiotics we can suggest in the rotation. Could fecal transplant help? Well, that's an interesting question. And in principle, there's no doubt that what we might want to do is to change someone with trimethylaminuria where the gut flora are producing trimethylamine. If we could change the gut flora so that they didn't have any of the bacteria that were producing trimethylamine, that would potentially be a very powerful tool. The problem is that we don't know which bacteria it is that's producing it. It's likely to be a normal bacteria that's just there in abnormal quantities for whatever. So at the moment, just giving a fecal transplant probably would be putting back the same bacteria again, perhaps in a different proportion. But we don't know why in certain people those bacteria grow up, and it may be to do with the environment they find them in the gut, if you like. So therefore, if you got rid of all of their own bacteria and then did a fecal transplant, you might actually end up growing up the same bacteria again. So in principle, perhaps, but I wouldn't recommend it at the moment because we'd be acting in a completely blind way. We don't know which bacteria it is we're trying to change, so we couldn't measure what we were putting in, and we couldn't measure any effects we had. I think that's another reason why we need to do more work on the actual bacteria flora present in the gut. And we've certainly been trying to get some money to do that, although without much success so far. I'm going to have to bring it to a halt soon, but I'll try and answer the next couple of questions. Do you think the fecal odors may be other FMO3 substrates, i.e. FMO3 malodor syndrome? We don't, I mean, it is true that FMO3 acts on a lot of different chemicals, not just trimethylamine, and a number of different drugs as well. And in fact, there have been suggestions that people with trimethylamine might be more sensitive to certain drugs than other people. We haven't really seen that to be the case. I simply don't think I can answer that question. It's equally possible that there will be other enzymes related to FMO3. There's certainly FMO1 and FMO2, for instance, which would have substrates that might cause odors. Has any thought been given to transdermal or choline injection with a synthetic diet? No, because not by me anyway. Because I don't think anybody's making themselves choline deficient. We do know how to monitor that. If, as I say, you can do it using synthetic diets, and that's made people's liver function tests go a bit funny and things, and we do look out for that. But I don't think I've seen anybody with choline deficiency. I think you'd have to. I think it would be pretty much impossible to make yourself choline deficient without a special synthetic diet. Can the enzymes necessary for converting TMA into TMAO be produced outside the body and then introduced to the body in some way? So that's a very good question. This would be a cure rather than a treatment. And it would be something we might call enzyme replacement therapy, which we do actually do for some of the diseases we deal with. A group of diseases called lysosomal storage diseases are treatable by enzyme replacement therapy, where the enzyme that's missing in the body is made by a pharmaceutical company in tissue culture and injected back in the body. They get injections into the vein once every couple of weeks, and it has varying success in different diseases and is always extremely expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Could that be done for trimethylamine with FMO3? Well, unfortunately, the answer is probably not at the moment. And it's an approach we'd like to use for a lot of genetic disorders. But the problem is that we could indeed make the FMO3 enzyme in tissue culture, and we could inject it back into the blood, but it would never get to where it was supposed to be. So the problem is that the cells in the liver have no way of taking up active enzyme from the blood and getting it into the part of the cell where it actually works. It gets broken down by the cell after taking up, and it never gets to where it's supposed to be. So you'd actually have to have the cell making it, the FMO3 itself, which would be a gene therapy approach. If you add to that what I've already said about what patients we see as adults, who most of them don't seem to have anything wrong with their FMO3 genes, and therefore probably are making an enzyme, then it's probably not going to be that useful an approach. And we need to think about why their own enzyme isn't working, rather than giving them more of the same. I don't know, Robin, I'm sure we could go on all night. I think perhaps we should think about drawing it to a close, but perhaps there's some way we can respond to written questions later on. I don't know.
Yeah, let's maybe wrap it up for this evening. I want to thank you and Heidi and Charlotte for taking the time to give us these presentations and answer all of our questions, kind of on behalf of all the 30 or so people in the room tonight. Really thank you for your time, and I think your answers and connections to patients really shows strongly, and it's something we all really appreciate. If there's any last words from you all, please unmute your microphones and say goodbye to the group.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for for tuning in. I hope it was useful. It's actually quite I think I've never done one of these before. I think it is probably quite a useful way of talking to people. As many will know, it's not impossible to reach us by email and things, and we always try and answer questions as best we can. And I'd like to thank Heidi and Charlotte as well for giving up their time too. That's my phone going. Heidi and Charlotte, what do you have to say?
I think we just also like to say thank you very much to everyone for sticking with us. Oh,
where's you?
Robin's still there.
Can I phone you back?
And we hope that some of the information from the survey has been useful. And then we hope to do another survey in the future, but we've got lots more questions that we'd like to ask.
Yes, and I also want to echo that as well. We want to thank everybody for tuning in and all your questions, and also thanks for everyone that completed the questionnaire. And we hope that you found it useful, because we certainly did.
Okay, so yeah, I think I can share everyone's presentations. tomorrow, and I'll share the recording of this video tomorrow on the TMAU community. So again, if you go to rareconnect.org and then select from the menu there the TMAU community, you can easily find it there. The webinar will I believe also be on the MEBO blog. I'm going to upload it to YouTube. Good night, Dr. Lachmann. Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks for all of your questions. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to leave the chat up here so people can continue to ask each other questions if they'd like. And yeah, I'll just write down my email as well. So it's just robert.pleticha@eurordis.org. If there's anything that you would like to see on the TMAU community on Rare Connect, just send me an email there. And yeah, on behalf of really everybody at Eurordis and the presenters that came tonight, thanks for tuning in. I think this went smoother than some maybe our first TMAU webinar, so I hope we can continue these, and we'll keep you updated on maybe the next specialist that might be able to come and talk to us and answer our questions. So I think that's about all I've got to say. So it was really nice being with you here again on a Sunday night, and catch you next time, and I'll make sure the link gets shared in all the right places, and the video gets shared in all the right places tomorrow. So yeah, have a good night.